Welcome to Thursday's Commodities Corner. I'm Elaine Stenson. The United States came a step closer to energy independence last month when, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, it produced more crude oil than it imported. Domestic oil production is at a 24-year high, while foreign oil imports are at a 17-year low. Bob McNally from Rapidan Group in Washington joins me on the line now. Bob, what is your response to this? How will it affect the price of oil in the US, and what does this mean for the US economy?
Well, it's the latest milestone in a trend that teaches energy analysts to be humble, because no one really saw this coming 5 to 7 years ago, and also is the most positive development in the U.S. economy, really, in the last several years. And so it's an unambiguous, positive, and surprising and welcome development for the U.S. economy that will have several clear benefits. One, it's going to improve the resilience of the U.S. economy to high oil prices. By reducing your imports, you can't escape the fact that the global market sets oil prices. Oil prices are set in a global market. But you can at least reduce your economy's vulnerability to price increases, because when you're importing less, you're keeping more of that money in your own economy. So it's going to improve jobs, it's going to improve our trade deficit, it's going to improve our borrowing costs, and it's going to improve our resilience to gyrations in the global oil market. And all those are unambiguously positive things in the oil side. And the natural gas side, of course, the differences in pricing that you see around the world, and the fact that the U.S. now is enjoying low prices for natural gas means it is rejuvenating our manufacturing sector.
The US will surpass Russia and Saudi Arabia as the world's top oil producer by 2015. Is this cause for concern for Russia's oil industry?
I don't think so. It's true that the U.S. is expected to surpass Russia in total liquids production. But you know, in the oil market, how much you produce doesn't matter so much. Russia has produced more than Saudi Arabia for quite some time, but no one would consider Russia as important as Saudi Arabia in the global oil market. What really matters for the global oil market and power in that market is your influence over pricing. And that doesn't depend so much on how much you produce, but whether you maintain spare production capacity and can adjust supply so as to reach your price targets. And in recent history anyway, Saudi Arabia is the only country that has done that. Russia is a large producer. The United States is a large producer. Saudi is a large producer. But Saudi Arabia has enjoyed real influence and power mainly because of its spare capacity, not because of the size of the production. Also, Elaine, as we look forward, most forecasts, including the IEA's World Energy Outlook that was just released this week, and even U.S. official forecasts, see the U.S. oil boom tapering off into the 2020s. And if you look at the decades beyond that, the Middle East is expected to resume its rising share in the global oil market. So the U.S. boom in oil will make us bigger, perhaps, than Russia for a few years, but eventually that'll sort of taper off. And again, in the oil market, big doesn't matter so much.
And finally, Bob, how does this affect the USA's relationship with the Middle East, and will Saudi Arabia start to lose some of its power?
Well, that's a very important question right now. In truth, we haven't really been terribly dependent on the Middle East and Saudi Arabia since the 1980s, when we had built our strategic reserves to cover our needs in case of a disruption and diversified our import sources to Canada and Venezuela. So the perceived linkage between the United States and the Middle East on pure oil supply is fairly low. Saudi Arabia is about 25% of our imports of crude. That has actually risen in recent years. We have to remember that as U.S. production has boomed recently, we have displaced African crude imports, not Saudi crude imports or not Gulf crude imports. So the $64,000 question in the next couple years is, as our production increases in the United States, will we move on to displace Saudi and Gulf imports? And that's an open question. That will depend partly on whether the Saudis are willing to price their crude exports to the United States competitively enough to stay in our market. And that really is an open question. Saudi Arabia has in the past resorted to price wars to defend its market share. And I think some U.S. producers are concerned that the Saudis may choose to fight for their market share rather than give it up, as the African exporters have recently. And if the Saudis decide to fight for market share and price their crude competitively, then it could threaten the economics of the relatively higher cost oil in the Eagle Ford and Permian and even Bakken basins and so forth. So what I am concerned about, though, is there is a pernicious downside to our increasing production and decreasing imports. And that is, there's a notion out there, not shared among energy experts, but I think more broadly in the foreign policy and political community, that, as you said, because we are importing less, we need the Middle East next, and we can afford to sort of pull out from global affairs or the Middle East. And I think that's a real mistake. I think that is having a real impact. It is amplifying a sort of a neo-isolationist trend in U.S. foreign policy, where you're seeing on both sides of the aisle a desire to pull back from foreign engagement. And as this is happening, the oil boom is convincing many people that we can safely withdraw from the Middle East because we no longer need that oil. But again, as I say, we haven't really needed that oil terribly since the 1980s. The region is still critically important for stability in global oil markets and prices, which we remain vulnerable to. And we also have a vital interest in how producers in that Middle East will be using their revenue windfall from their rising market share out into the future in higher prices. So in my view, while we still have a strong, vital national interest in the Middle East, our energy boom, ironically, is convincing us that we don't. And that's a pernicious and unfortunate trend, I think, in U.S. foreign policy.
Bob, many thanks for joining me on the line today. And that's all for today's Commodities Corner. But do check back next week for more updates and interviews. Bye for now.